one. All right, Tracy. So one of the first questions I always ask people, and you can go in whatever direction you'd like. Having read your book, I think I might know a little bit how you're going to answer this. But what were you like growing up, and what were some of the things that stood out about you, interests, what drove you when you were growing up in Southern California?
So growing up in Southern California, I was bullied a lot. I talk about that a lot in my book. I think as a result of the bullying, I didn't have a lot of confidence in myself and who I was. I sort of became somewhat of an introvert. A lot of the way I would sort of express myself or my emotions, I was a dancer. So that's sort of like how I got my emotions out. But I really grew up with like sort of a lack of confidence and somewhat shy because of bullying.
And you mentioned that you had a love of politics early on, and you hear a lot of people when they're younger, they love sports, or they want to be a police officer, or they want to be a movie star. But I guess it seemed like for you at a younger age than normal, you kind of connected to politics, as wide of a net as that word casts. What drew you to politics at a young age?
That's a really good question. I think growing up, my mom was sort of a news junkie, I guess. I always remember the news being on, specifically political news. I don't know that we talked about politics a whole lot in our house, but I grew up in sort of the age of Reagan, right, like in the 80s. And he was very prolific and, talked a lot. And I remember when the Challenger disaster happened, and he gave that really famous Challenger speech. And I think for me, that made politics like real, because in that speech, he was talking to us. We had watched the Challenger explode in our classroom. I think I grew up in an environment where sort of all points of view were entertained. And I found that very fascinating. And then when I got into high school, we had this really, I guess, sort of notorious vibrant teacher who really made politics sort of come alive to a lot of us. And that was sort of my first foray into it.
One of the things, and you mentioned getting bullied at the very beginning, one of the things you mentioned in the book, and just, as a reminder, the book, The Unexpected Spy, From the CIA to the FBI, My Secret Life Taking Down Some of the World's Most Notorious Terrorists. It's an amazing book. I mentioned to you before we started, I am a slow reader. I got through this book about as quickly as any book that I've ever read. But you do talk about the theme of getting bullied is woven kind of throughout. I was really impressed when I read it. It never seemed, and you kind of, I guess, alluded to the idea of fitting in, but it seemed like instead of wanting to fit in and totally compromising who you were to do that, you were kind of on the other end where it's like, no, this is me. I'm going to keep being me. And you resisted that urge. It seemed like maybe I interpreted the book wrong, but if that is in fact the case, where did you get that? Because that's something that you don't see a lot of people have the discipline to do, stay true to themselves as opposed to resisting the urge to fit in when they're growing up.
That is actually such a good question, Jared, because yes, I grew up without a whole lot of confidence, but at the same time, you're right. I did have this confidence, right, to sort of not succumb to, I guess, the peer pressures, if you will, of being able to fit in. I think for me, it's interesting. I was bullied in elementary school and junior high, and then in high school, I can remember sort of this tipping point where I was a freshman and I was at a party, and it was a cool party, right? The cool kids had sort of invited me to, and it was so exciting. And I was offered drugs at that party. And I remember calling my mom from the person's house and asking my mom to pick me up. Because I knew that was wrong. And I think that was a turning point for me, right? I could have taken the road that those people would have traveled and become one with the cool kids, right? And I decided not to. And I wish I could tell you where that sort of moral compass or whatever came from. I'm going to guess it came from my parents, but I don't remember ever having a conversation with them, sort of sitting down saying, don't do drugs, right? That kind of conversation. I'm guessing it came from them because they obviously modeled really great behavior. But I don't remember a specific time where we had that conversation, if that makes any sense.
No, absolutely. Okay, so I just for people listening, there are going to be questions I'm going to ask Tracy, and I guess there's a chance that maybe she can't go into everything because of her her loyalty and responsibility as a at one point a CIA operative. I think after reading the book, I have a sense of what you can and can't answer, but
Sure.
I guess before we get into maybe book specific questions, without preventing people from feeling the need to read the book, what was that process like? What led you to decide to want to write the book? And in any way, you were very honest and raw in a lot of what you shared. Was that a therapeutic experience, or how would you characterize that experience?
So writing the book, it for me, I don't want to ostracize any of your listeners. So for me, obviously I've been out of the agency for a while, and my husband had always been bothering me. I met him actually a month after I left the FBI. So he never knew me in that time, but he had always sort of bothered me, I guess, to write a book about my experiences. And I never did, because I'm actually rather private of a person. And I became very upset in 2016, and I decided, and I think I allude to this in my book, about you sort of stop bitching and start a revolution. One thing my parents have always instilled in me is stop complaining and do something about it. And so I just became very, very frustrated with the political climate and the way that the CIA was being treated. And so I started writing, actually. I started writing for some newspapers, and that was a way to get my feelings out, I guess. And my husband was like, hey, you really should do this now and write a book. And, you should do it for our daughter, too. So she sort of has this, I guess, journal of what you did with your life. And I think that was really the impetus that got me to start writing the book.
So you mentioned the way maybe the CIA is framed, and one of the, I guess, one of the periods in which perhaps the CIA was unfairly judged or criticized was in response to 9/11. And you talk about that in the book, how people look at that unfairly so as the CIA's fault and whatnot. And you're a part of the CIA at that point. How did you cope with that? Because I know, Tracy, from my experience doing sports radio and TV, we get a lot of what we say twisted and misconstrued, and it is so tough for me to not want to punch a hole through the computer and tell these people, no, that's not at all what I said. You dealt with that on a much more serious and larger scale. So how did you cope with that, and how did you kind of stay in your lane and realize, hey, I just got to put my head down and continue to do the great work that I know we're doing here?
So maybe being bullied helped with that. I sort of just drowned out the noise. I always have. Even if people have criticism even about my book, for me, what I do is always just try to wish them well, because to be honest with you, they look worse than I do if I have sort of a bad comeback to them. I think with the CIA and the blame of September 11th, it's very easy to play, Monday morning quarterback, right? And to could have, would have, should have. And the reality is if I sat around and listened to the people that were criticizing us and criticizing what we were doing, then that would seriously inhibit my ability to try to stop future attacks. And I think I owed that to the American people, to not sit around and sort of wallow in the frustration that I felt.
So a part of the book, and you don't go into detail of the conversations, but you do share some experiences and I guess parts of your responsibilities in which you would talk to some of the most dangerous people in the world, and you would be in a room with these people, terrorists from various parts of the world. What would you do to stay calm in those situations? I imagine it would not be very hard to be nervous. But you need to be calm and poised having these conversations in which you're trying to gain information. Was that natural for you to just walk into these rooms and be calm, or how did you evolve in that regard?
So I think it was natural for me. I think it's just an inherent part of my personality. A lot of people always ask, what do I need, qualification-wise to get into the CIA? And I mean, certainly college education, all of that, but a lot of it is your personality, right? If you're naturally just some person that overreacts and is really nervous and anxious all the time, then you're probably not going to be the best fit right, for working there. So for me, part of it was just my personality. But the other part, too, is I think I had the fact that I was very young on my side. I think, in your early 20s, maybe this is right or wrong, I don't know, but you have a sense of like invincibility, right, about you, and you're not thinking about the dangers of the situation, the dangerous person really that's sitting in front of you. And I think that worked in my favor tremendously.
Yeah, it is crazy that you were fresh out of college dealing with, I mentioned some of the most dangerous people in the world. This was not as a, 35-year-old seasoned veteran of living life. This was shortly after graduating from, I'm biased in saying this, and you are too, one of the best schools in the country, USC, which is amazing. And I guess I'm curious, it's important for you in any situation like this. You're interviewing someone, whether you're interviewing in the setting in which you did, in which you're dealing with dangerous people trying to gain information, or just something like this that we're doing, or any conversation. It's important to establish a connection. So I guess I'm curious, how would you try and establish a connection with someone who you knew hated you, and deep down you didn't think too highly of them? And then I guess on top of that, how do you apply some of those ideas in just regular life in dealing with people?
So I think one thing my husband always tells me is I'm actually a really good judge of people the instant that I meet them face to face. I can really kind of tell what makes a person tick right from the beginning. And that is actually a very critical tool to have in the agency when you're recruiting assets. And to be honest with you, prisoners are no different than assets, right? You're trying to recruit them to be nice to you and give you information. And so for me, one of the things I would try to establish was not commonality. I know that I don't have anything in common with them, but just the fact that I cared and listened to what they had to say. So for me, it was just a process of getting to know them. Getting to know what they like, getting to know what they dislike. And then from there, maybe the next day bringing them something that they like if it's a treat. And that helps establish a sense of rapport. And, the rapport isn't about getting them to like me. I really don't care if they do or not. But the rapport is about getting them to give me information. And if that means that I have to bring a piece of fruit or candy or whatever it is that he likes, then that's what I'm going to do.
All right. I want to get into one of the, you mentioned the reasons why you wrote the book, and one of the themes is, empowering women, and I want to get to that. But before we do, your role in the CIA is intense, and in some ways, and you kind of mentioned this, the switch never really flips off at any point. I guess it can't, but you still, would talk about the opportunities to maybe separate from work for just a bit, or watch a mindless TV show instead of the news, or when you would travel, the night before a major moment or meeting, you try and sightsee. How important were those moments and the ability to find some sense of levity in a job that is as intense and maybe even at times in a good way because of the impact you can have, but burdensome as your role with the CIA?
I think that that's essential, in my honest opinion. I think a lot of people view that as frivolous or not serious, but the thing is being able to clear my head gets me in a better place to do what I need to do before an important meeting. And if that, sightseeing or watching a mindless TV show is viewed as frivolous, it really does have a purpose, at least for me, in terms of getting my head in the right space. Because if I never, ever, ever, ever turn it off, I'm never going to approach something with fresh eyes and kind of that 360 perspective that, in my opinion, is extremely important at the CIA. Okay,
so Tracy, you shared some stories throughout the book of situations in which that help illustrate the obstacles that women have to deal with and overcome, even in situations where you would think there's no way in heck these people at this level with, what's at stake would demonstrate any sort of sexist thoughts or actions, but that isn't always the case. And, I encourage people to read this book for a number of reasons, but this is certainly one of them. It's mind-boggling, really. So I guess my first question is, we kind of go down this path. Who were some of the women who really impacted you and influenced you growing up? And and maybe even once you got to the CIA?
So for me, I just want to be clear, the CIA was a great environment for females. At least that was my lived experience. It was really the FBI where I had a
Sorry,
lot of
yeah.
issues.
And I definitely didn't want to
I just don't.
insinuate that either. I
Yeah,
apologize.
no, it's okay. So for me, growing up, definitely my mom. I mean, was just a huge influence to me. She's a really strong person, and I think all I ever want, is to please her, and I adore my mom. She pretty much means everything to me. So I'd say she was my biggest influence growing up, and also my grandmother. My grandma spent her life traveling, the whole world, and so I think that's what kind of got the travel bug, I guess, lit in me. At the agency, I can't be super specific about the other employees, but I would say I met so many women that were my same age and sort of my same state in life that I'm still friends with them today, and they were bridesmaids in my wedding. And I would say it's a place where women supported each other and sort of lifted each other up.
And I want to follow up with a question you can't answer, but there are a lot of women who are doing, amazing things around the world in this country. And I know through your book, you were able to meet some incredibly successful, powerful people. Is there someone, is there a woman you were able to meet, whether it's a public figure or someone who is just special to you through your role that was just, whether it was a tremendous experience or not, it was a cool, like, check off the list type of deal. Like, I got to meet and spend or have a conversation with this person?
That's a great question. There are two. I just can't really be specific about
That's
them.
fine.
I'm
Yeah,
so
yeah.
sorry.
Nope, that's all
Okay.
good. I figured, I knew there was a risk in asking that. I didn't know.
Okay.
All right. So you, and to kind of fast forward after your time in the CIA, you referenced you went to the FBI, not the greatest experience. There's stories about that in the book. And then you spent the last almost a decade or right around a decade teaching at Hockaday, which people in DFW probably are familiar. It's a renowned all girls school in the Dallas area, and you kind of got to fulfill a lot of what you laid out uh, in the book of empowering women and sharing that these opportunities are out there and they're possible. I'd hate to ask you to compare experiences, but how rewarding has your post CIA FBI life been in getting to work with these young women at such an influential age, I guess, to be able to give them the type of education that you don't typically get in a classroom setting, especially as you go through high school?
Oh, it's been extremely rewarding. One thing I've sort of realized is that typically I think people look at, the intelligence world and the law enforcement world as these male-dominated careers. And I think that is probably why women are underrepresented in them. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but, females don't see other females in these roles or these jobs. They're less inclined to seek them because they don't view them as applying to them. And so I think being able to be in a school that's all girls and teaching 11th and 12th graders and creating a class on espionage, foreign policy, and national security, and seeing so many of them go into those careers has been extremely rewarding because it shows me that they're changing the gender narrative and they're seeing themselves in these careers. And I'm not saying that men shouldn't be in them; they absolutely should, but we need to kind of even out the gender disparity because females offer a different perspective just as males offer a different perspective, and I think both of them are needed.
All right, you encountered, I mean, I guess anyone does, but you maybe in this case it's a little more amplified with your career. What's you encountered people with different backgrounds, different perspectives, whether they were quote unquote teammates of yours at the CIA or FBI or people who were trying to do terrible things around the world. You were around a bunch of different people, different perspectives. How have those experiences influenced you and maybe how you carry yourself, having, I guess, consumed so many different perspectives over the course of your life?
I think the biggest influence has been sort of my time in the Middle East and my experience with Islam and with Muslims. I think for me, I grew up as a Jew, and not a super religious Jew. I'm definitely more reformed, but I had almost no exposure to the Islamic world at all. And the exposure that I did have was really just one-sided. And so I think I took Islam when I was in college, and I really enjoyed it a lot. And so I think for me, being able to be in those countries and meet people there was just this eye-opening experience that really made me have a 360 view of sort of the, issues surrounding the two religions. And it was fascinating.
What would you, if you were talking to people about that specifically, and understanding that, not everyone from a certain country is horrible, not everyone who is a part of a certain religion is horrible, and we like to generalize sometimes. Like, what would the message be that you would like to deliver to people, and just understanding from your experiences what stood out and what's important as far as humans treating humans properly?
The only way, in my opinion, that I think you can have a true unbiased perspective is you have to go meet the other person or try to walk in their shoes, and see things from their perspectives. And I think we have to realize that, I really do think, unfortunately, religions, people, races, ethnicities sometimes are defined by their lowest common denominator, and that's not fair. Terrorists, the way I view it, is every religion has its extremists. Christians, Jews, Muslims, everyone has its extremists. Unfortunately for Muslims, their extremists did something huge, right, that had worldwide sort of implications. And you have to realize that they're not the majority of the population. I think that's a really hard thing for people to sort of wrap their brains around sometimes.
I don't want to, I've tried to be delicate and not asking too many book-specific questions so as to give people the idea they don't need to read it. But you did share towards the end of the book your experience transitioning from the CIA to the FBI, and without wanting to lead you down a certain path, I guess, what would you be comfortable or willing to share, about your FBI experience? Because and you referenced it earlier, it wasn't as great of an experience as you had with the CIA. So I guess what years removed now from that, what are still some of your takeaways?
I think my biggest regret, so I left the CIA really just for the simple reason I didn't want to travel overseas anymore. I absolutely loved it. I just didn't want to travel out overseas. And so I think for me, the biggest takeaway that I had is you can't assume that two agencies are exactly the same, because they're not. But I think for me, what I had wished that I had done more with the FBI was fought back. I don't think I fought back enough. I sort of just kind of caved and left, right, and quit when I just couldn't take it anymore. And I really wish that I had fought back.
All right, Tracy, you then go from the FBI after a career in the CIA, and you transition. We talked about teaching and things that I guess don't require you to deal with dangerous people as much, and act as a spy, so to speak. What was that transition like for you? Not the transition from the CIA to the FBI, but the transition from the CIA and FBI to, I don't know, is it civilian line? I don't know what the proper characterization is, but I guess a different line of work.
It really wasn't that hard. The biggest, I guess, shock to me, though, because obviously I'd been in a very insular environment, right? CIA, I'm around like-minded people. FBI, I'm around like-minded people. For me, because I went into my master's of education, what I realized, though, was some of my professors did not like me because of what I did. They had a lot of preconceived notions, not all of them, but some of them had some preconceived notions about torture and this and that, and just stereotyped me from the beginning. And I was not prepared for that, because I just had been around people that didn't judge me for that, right? And so I would say that was sort of the biggest adjustment.
Do you still feel like you deal with that? Like when you tell people, I don't know how often you just offer up in random conversation. I used to work in the CIA, but do you feel like you still have people look at you sideways because of that, or is that not as much of an issue today?
Well, I think it's frustrating for me because if I tell people I'm a teacher, which is, yeah, I'm a teacher, I'm really proud of it. People are very dismissive of me. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. And they just don't take me seriously or don't think I'm anything smart or interesting. But then when I tell them, that I worked with the CIA, FBI, then I all of a sudden command respect from them. And that actually is what's more frustrating to me, is that I think you should respect everyone and anyone, no matter, what their career choices are. So sometimes that's really what frustrates me the most. But that's about it.
Okay, so you mentioned throughout the book, dealing with failure, and there's one specific part of the book. I noted the page, and I highlighted some stuff where you felt like maybe you failed. How do you deal with whether it's in the CIA or just in life? Like, what are some of the things that you've learned and the tools you use to deal with failure and overcoming failure to get back on the horse, so to speak, and keep doing whatever it is you're trying to pursue?
There's always tomorrow. I think, I know that sounds like oversimplify, but for me, there's always tomorrow. There's always the next day, right? You can always do better, fix it, do it differently the next day. That's how I've always looked at it.
Was there anyone who, like, in that regard, just because I think that's such an important part of living daily life is whether it's in your marriage, your work, with friends, like you're gonna make mistakes, and the mistakes that you make maybe today don't have the same consequences. Certainly I know my mistakes, thankfully, that they don't have the same consequences as maybe the mistakes you faced as potential mistakes in the CIA. But who was there someone who really helped you in that regard, even if you can't put a name to it? Like, were there the people who sort of mentored you as to, hey,
oh yeah,
Tracy, you're
sure.
Okay. Like, what were, I guess, how did those conversations or what was that process like for you to get to where you have this great perspective on overcoming failure versus maybe where you were when you first joined the CIA?
I don't know that it was CIA specific. I think for me, I'd always overcome failure. I don't think that was a CIA specific thing.
Okay, so it's just something that you felt like you had a really strong grasp of through experiences growing up and pre-CIA.
Yeah, we just didn't dwell on it. My parents were always like, okay, get back up, figure it out. We just didn't dwell on it.
Bullying. We talked about it earlier. You then went back after your time in the CIA and the FBI and you taught. And, you taught at high school. I'm sure that bullying went on. I don't know how much you were able to see it, when you were in the classroom. But what would your takeaways be from your experiences and for someone who's listening who maybe is getting bullied and maybe even adults who feel like they're getting bullied? Like, how did you learn to deal with that? I know we kind of talked about how you stayed true to who you were, but years removed from getting bullied growing up, what are some of the things that you think are important, especially now having spent a decade teaching and being around high school girls who I imagine engaged in some form of bullying, whether you saw it or you didn't?
So I'd say find someone who can be an advocate for you. I never really had anyone that was sort of a strong advocate for me, but I try to be a very strong advocate for my students. And to create sort of a safe space where they can come and just talk and not be judged. So I think that's sort of my biggest piece of advice to them.
And did you see that at Hockaday and did you step in, or did you feel like you had the opportunity to kind of be an advocate for some of the young women who were maybe on the receiving end of that?
Yes, I think they would tell you that I was.
I imagine that, as much as the lessons in the classroom, that was probably really rewarding for you to kind of be able to right some of the wrongs that maybe you experienced growing up.
Yes, I definitely so.
Okay, so Uh, did I see or read that your book is maybe going to become a TV show?
Yes. So Ellen Pompeo has a production company called Calamity Jane, and she purchased the rights to it to develop it into a TV show. But obviously, right now everything's sort of on hold given the current climate. So I don't have, unfortunately, too many updates to give you with that. I'm so sorry, but it has, yes, it's been purchased for development.
Okay, we will be tracking that and
Yes.
sharing updates when we get them.
Yes.
Finally, last question I have for you, Tracy. I always like to ask this too for people who have achieved at a high level. What's next for you? Like what when you assess goals and now you've got a family, you've got a husband, you got a daughter. Uh, so you can go in any direction you'd like with this, but what are your goals moving forward? What are things you'd still like to achieve?
um, I think one of the things I'd really like to do is to get involved with national security and foreign policy, like policy making and policy writing. That is something I've always wanted to do, but I've never really found a way to get involved in it. But I will. I promise you, I will.
Okay.
So that's really something that I would like to do.
And I lied. I said one last question. I got one more. You mentioned
Sure.
you do still do a lot of work to help empower women and give them the tools or the inspiration to go out and accomplish amazing things. For anyone listening, are there things that you'd like to share about that? Things maybe ways women can get involved or ways people can kind of support some of your efforts and what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. I sit on the board of directors of an organization called Girl Security, and they are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides national security, foreign policy curriculum to girls in public and private schools nationwide. They do wargaming. They do all kinds of really great hands-on things to show young women, like really grades kind of 8 through 12, that these are careers that are feasible for them, and they provide them with mentors, whether it be the military, defense, intelligence, State Department, diplomacy, what have you. It's just an amazing organization, and I really encourage people to check it out.